Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to poet Deborah DeNicola, author of The Impossible. Before I introduce you to Deborah, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poet2poet.substack.com and you can subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So today I'm thrilled to introduce you to Deborah DeNicola. Her seventh book is The Impossible from Kelsey Press, which was published in 2021. She's also the author of Original Human and has edited a book called Orpheus and Company, Contemporary Poems on Greek Mythology, which came out from the University Press of New England. Her previous books include Where Divinity Begins, from Alice James, Inside Light, and two prize-winning chapbooks, Harmony of the Next and Psyche Revisited. Her memoir, The Future That Brought Her Here, was published by Ibis Press in 2009. Among other awards, Deborah has received a National Endowment Fellowship in Poetry. So Deborah, welcome to Poet. It's wonderful to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Radha.
So today we're going to be talking about Deborah's seventh book, The Impossible, and where that book started and how it developed. So Deborah, would you mind sharing a little bit about the process of developing the poems for this book?
Yes, I'd love to. I was working towards this book for about 8 years, and it changed a lot over the time. For one thing, there's a center section in the book that is a kind of sequence of 21 poems about my father's death and afterlife. At the time that I wrote those poems, I was teaching Dante's Inferno, and my father died of an overdose of drugs. And I had my own thoughts about, I'm a Course in Miracles person, if anyone recognizes what that is. If not, that's fine. But I do believe there's an afterlife in our energy field. And so I just imagined taking him through not knowing that he was dead, and then having a lot of regrets, and eventually redeeming himself. And it was very healing for me. I actually wrote most of them in at the Centrum Foundation in Washington State, where I had been born and my father had lived for a long time. And they were just magically came to me. And I never thought that at the time, that years later, I would also be dealing with my mother dying. She had dementia. She was 94 when she died, but I was her caretaker. And so those poems came just naturally over those years. And I realized that this book was about my father and my mother to some extent, but also the kind of sad stories around them. And I didn't want it to be totally sad, because I also was healing myself at the time in a lot of different modalities, and making my peace with my parents. And so I had another section, it's kind of sprinkled throughout the book, which is our more spiritual poems that are kind of looking for a kind of self-acceptance and healing. And then I had some love poems that had come up years before, and I wanted to include those because some of them were about loss of love, which any of us write about. And so in a way, the whole book is about loss. But it's interesting that when I gave it to 4 different people for blurbs, they all just wrote about the father sequence mostly. And I didn't really expect that would be the section that would gather the most attention. So yeah, and I was like, how do I work all these poems in together? Sometimes you want to put a poem in that just doesn't really fit. And so there is a two sections that are kind of shuffling with love poems and spiritual poems. They kind of balance the other two sections of the parents.
So it sounds like you were really deliberate in the tone and changing the tone from poem to poem or section to section.
Yeah, that was hard because there was a lot of different tones.
Yeah.
and some of the spiritual poems are kind of celebratory and about loving the earth and loving life, and then there's some very painful stuff as well, especially with my mother, who I really observed for 5 years, just losing herself. But I wasn't deliberate in putting it together, and for a long time. I was sort of unconsciously working on it, I think. And my process, like I've heard other poets do this, is I put the poems all over the floor and walk around and try to see what first lines and last lines kind of go together, and to try to find an order. I also found that I use the word sky a lot. And so in a way, that's a kind of thread that holds the whole book together a little. But then the title poem, The Impossible, is about a short story by Chekhov, and really has nothing to do with my family life or my personal emotions. But I taught that story, and I've always felt a lot of empathy for the characters in the story. And then the book had a couple of different names over the periods. And when I came up with The Impossible, which was the poem about Chekhov, I realized it fit the other poems too, because certainly my father's afterlife was somewhat impossible. And having just the stamina to observe my mother and live through all that seemed every day like it was impossible. So it has a couple of different levels of meaning.
Yeah.
When I found the title, but I think it was a workshop with Carolyn Forche where she suggested find out what words you use the most, and sprinkle them around the book, and it can hold it. And so I thought the sky theme was kind of interesting. There's one poem where I'm really looking up into the sky and I see a wedding going on in the clouds. And I think a lot of it too, because of my background in Jungian psychology, was interested in the masculine and the feminine, and how they balance each other, and how we each contain both. Yeah, so
it's interesting, that you mentioned sky, and you mentioned also that you were sort of in dialogue with Dante's Inferno, which is a descent. And so you've got the sky as a thread, but then you're sort of in dialogue with that movement under. So can you say more about the dialogue with the Inferno?
yeah, I think well, there's kind of an archetypal sacred abyss in Jungian language, and in the process of that most of us go through in terms of a midlife crisis, or a midlife changing of heart, or we find ourselves on a different journey at different times, and that's punctuated by periods of darkness and this crossing, themes like crossing the water and descending into the bowels of something, and having to struggle with it and fight your way back. And the hero that or heroine that Joseph Campbell talks about, comes back up to the surface with new knowledge for having been down below. And the sky, as Dante went on to write, of course, the Purgatorio and the Paradiso, and which he also surfaces. And I use the sky for my father's healing too, that he has to realize what happened to him and then process that, and deals with multidimensional selves that come to help heal him. Because I think we're all kind of multidimensional. Yeah, I think in one of my prose poems, I mentioned the divine abyss, that it's scary when you're in it and nobody wants to go there. And many poets deal with depression in one way or another. And yet it makes you more sensitive and more compassionate to other people. And you do get that new knowledge that you can bring back to people. And I'm very interested in dreams and dream work, and all the images that come from that. Yes.
So you mentioned that you, in our conversation before we hit record, you mentioned that you're a certified dream coach, and that dream imagery often makes its way into your poems. Can you say a little bit about that, that territory of working with dream material in poems?
Yeah, I record my dreams. A lot of people do. There was times when I used to write them down, and then there was times when I was in analysis and I actually held a tape recorder next to my bed, and I didn't even have to open my eyes to tell my dream. And it was a very, very rich time for me. With I had like 6 dreams a week that were like, I was overwhelming the analyst. But I think that those poles that we were just talking about, the abyss and the sky, one of the ways I look at a dream is there's always a dark and a light. There's always a place where the most tension is, and there's always a place where you're more comfortable. And so your projections, everything in your dream is you. So feeling your way through those images and the postures of the other figures and the landscape and the tone and the colors, and allows you to experience all these different subjectivities that you have. And the goal in my guidance for working with people with dreams is to bring all of those things together and have them feel them all together at the end. And it's very balancing. And often a new image will come up because it's like an active imagination. You're revisiting the dream, but it's not, of course, exactly the dream, and it's not exactly reality, because we get into a kind of a slow brain state and things happen. So a lot of it's about reconciliation, and I think that's what I was talking about in some of these poems. There's a dark side, and then there's the light, and how you get from one to the other. And so many poets have, not been able to climb out of the dark side. When you think of Sylvia Plath or John Berryman, or even Robert Lowell or Elizabeth Bishop, I mean, a lot of them struggled with addictions and depression. And I think a lot of poets do. But if you are brave enough to go there, it can be very, very healing.
It just strikes me how similar that process is around working with dream material and what we do as poets on the page to bring so many disparate or contradictory or contrasting elements into that space in order to make a new sense of it, or a new wholeness, or it's integrative. So it
Uh-huh.
sounds very powerful as a practice for poets, to maybe look at,
I think it really does lead to ideas in writing. Uh, and I have to just pitch my dream book for a minute, but this is a book of essays on the process, and it's a small book available on Amazon.
and
But
we'll link to that in the show notes here. So
oh,
yeah,
good.
yeah,
Thank you.
that's
Thank you.
a wonderful resource. So getting back to the nuts and bolts of the book a little bit, you you mentioned that you took, a number of years, and this is very, very common for poets to take, 5, 10, even 20 years. Some poets that I've talked to put together a manuscript. How was the process different for this one compared to others? Was it any different? Any reflections on sort of this unique challenge for this book?
Well, my previous book, Original Human, I was doing in the 90s. I was struck with this great interest in the Course in Miracles and in Mary Magdalene. And it was kind of like a Mary Magdalene wave that came in. And, suddenly there were books about Mary Magdalene everywhere. And who was she really? And I actually I read about this in my memoir. I went on a trip with some other women to France, and we visited all the Black Madonnas who are connected to Mary Magdalene, as in kind of an esoteric alternate Christianity that got kind of buried. And so I have a number of poems in that book in Mary Magdalene's voice, and poems about John the Baptist and Jesus and Judas. And so that book had more of a conscious shaping to it. I sort of knew where I was going with it, but there's also a lot of love poems in it too. And my first full book, I had a chapbook beforehand, so I used some of those poems that were in the chapbook. But Where Divinity Begins was a book I worked on probably for 10 years after getting my MFA, and having a manuscript when you leave the program, but then going through many changes. And there's a lot of poems that are ekphrastic on paintings, and I've always been interested in the arts. And there's a lot of sections with angels in them, because there was that whole angel movement that seemed to come into the collective unconscious in the 90s. I don't know. It's still always problematic to try to see how everything's going to fit. And you do take one poem that you might love and say, this just isn't going to be in this book. So it gets more conscious from book to book, I think. You could feel like you learn a little bit more about what you're doing. And when I first started, sort of came out of the closet with my poems in the 70s, most books did not have themes really in them. They were just different poems. And I read people like Tess Gallagher and Mark Strand was a teacher of mine at one point. And also I was very influenced by the South American poets, and who were Mark Strand and Charles Simic were translating at the time. So this whole surreal movement really came into contemporary poetry, and that hadn't been there before. But it was like Fernando Pessoa and Cesare Pavese, the Italian poet, that I remember reading, and Cavafy, and they put out a book called Another Republic, which is a wonderful anthology. I think it's still available. And I was very influenced by these foreign writers that were actually in translation. Just the images were just amazing. Neruda, of course. Although I still consider my preeminent poem, God that I want to worship in poetry, is W.S. Merwin. I just think he's been amazing. So I don't know if that answers the question. Or
Yeah,
what.
I mean, it's very interesting, the way you're describing, the moment in which, we all live in the moment that we are living, right? We don't necessarily have a choice, but to be able to see, sort of the progression from the 70s and these translations and what was entering the poetic culture at that time, to where we are now, and to have been creating different books over that time span. It does seem to me that you probably have a great perspective on different possibilities. I hear a lot from my younger students in particular, this anxiety around having a theme, having an arc and a specific story that the book is telling.
And yeah, and that's, I remember the first book I really felt that was like Carolyn Forshay's on when she returned from El Salvador, Country Between Us. And it was political, and it got a lot of attention. It got a lot of criticism for being political, and was she exploiting a situation and all that kind of thing. But it was brilliant, and she's been a favorite teacher of mine forever. In fact, her new book, In the Lateness of the World, is just gorgeous. And like a lot of people, and I find myself too, the poems I'm writing now are these post-apocalyptic sort of poems. I mean, here we had this pandemic for 2 years, and the world seems, we certainly didn't expect, I don't know, I didn't expect in 2022 that we'd still have wars. I was a baby boomer and sort of, a child, a flower child in my 20s, and I studied astrology. I've studied a lot of occult systems, tarot and numerology. And anyways, we're in the abyss right now. And hopefully we'll come out of it with some faith. And that's what I've been writing about in my poems recently.
Well, and to your point earlier about the descent in Dante, and making that descent, and hopefully, like Dante, coming out of that into a new set of perceptions. So it seems to me that in this time we need poetry more than ever in our lives as a practice, as poets, to go in, do that descent, come, and then give to the world, those new perceptions.
Yeah, and it's life-saving. I mean, I did have a midlife crisis from a heartbreak in the end of a relationship, which a lot of people experience, but it took me a long time to get over it. And that's what really pulled me into therapy in the beginning. And then I realized this relationship that I lost was bigger than, in my mind and in my heart, than it really was. But it was the loss of my father when I was a teenager, and I never dealt with that. My mother was very stoic, and we just went on and didn't grieve really. So yeah, and so coming out of that was, I came out at a new level, at a new place, with I'm a lapsed Catholic, but with this tremendous new sense of faith and mysticism.
Mhm.
And I'm still in that mindset. Of course, we've all been reading Corona poems for 2 years now. And I think hopefully that we'll get beyond that now.
Yeah. Well, whether it's about coronavirus and the losses that we've suffered through that, or the ordinary losses of loved ones, the inevitable losses that we all feel, I just want to recommend to everybody who's watching that they pick up your book. And I was wondering if you might want to share a couple poems in closing from the book to give our
book right here.
Yeah, to give our audience a little taste of some of what we've been talking about.
Well, you had a request, right?
I did. I love this poem, The Goose Girls' Foot. I just think it's a phenomenal example of taking a very ordinary object and moments that could just kind of go unnoticed, and making something incredibly poignant out of it. So,
oh, thank you. It is a true story, and a lot of it does have talk about this Yadro image, this I don't know what to call it, sculpture or whatever that my mother had, and they were very popular in the 70s, I think, and she loved this goose girl, and the foot broke off. And so this is the story of that. The goose girl's foot. The Yadro goose girl lay on the coffee table in mother's living room for years. For years, she watched the clear martinis drain. She wasn't sad to be broken. She didn't mind time. She didn't mind change, just stared at the flower in her hand, its eternal blooming, and mother adored her. Years later, deep in dementia, mother tried to glue the foot back on with cold cream. That was before she stopped talking. That was when she could still walk, when she surprised us daily, soup poured into a wine glass. Soon enough, she lived in the fog of a body almost brainless. To lose a foot, to lose a mind, what creatures are we that parts of us break off? At the end, she shut her eyes for a week, shut lips, refused to eat. In the last hours, her eyes flew open, fixed on a point I couldn't contact, and a slight cry leaked from her silence, while the lacrima mortis swelled down her cheek. I could see what work it was for her to die at 95, even with hospice nearby and morphine under the tongue. For hours, her skin incrementally purpled, the way her brain blackened as the million thieves swept in. While my mother labored into death, I wrung her mottled hands, hoping each breath would be the last. Oh, my mother, my rock, so whole, so gorgeous, gone to a ghost before my eyes. Good neighbor John glued the goose girl's foot back on the week after my mother died. Where I had failed, my fingers stuck. He focused deftly, made that foot fit.
just lovely.
Yeah, actually, that poem took a long time. I dwelt on it a long time. I did have another favorite poem about my mother from the book, if I could I just thought about that one. It's called Mother Incarnate, because I think a lot of us are going to be dealing with elderly parents, and certainly my generation is. So it's called Mother Incarnate. My mother asleep on the chaise with the moving water adjacent. We two only residents at the pool, late spring afternoon. Long shadows from the high-rise swaddle the lounges. Dark towels of treetops fold over brick tiles. Supple sun in the rails of the catwalk. Slatted shadow cast on the grounds. Always the dark and the light, dark and light. The pooled water keeps moving because the wind is up and the palms are passing it between them, finger by finger. A rush of messages only a mystagogue might decipher. The swish and the wash of the breeze complements the clouds rumpling toward comfort. The water goes where the wind says, and the voices of gulls follow. The water moves because the wind says something moving. What a mother might say to her daughter, calming her worries before she must sing for a crowd. I remember my mother praying always, now almost cheerfully waiting to die. Breath expectant each night. Like anyone, she preferred to pass over in sleep. Proud mother who says out loud, nonetheless, she's aware of her mind's decay under crimped skin, aware of a silkworm lighting her limbs, something spoken in code by trees and shadows, small strokes like those that skirt across water. One spark burnt here, one brain cell's invisible damage, memories, chemicals draining away, the skull visible behind her smile, what life did, what it does to us all. The truth of my mother incarnate at 90 in the sundowning hour, my own head deflowering like hers. In this moment, we're two peonies weighted with sun, how they sing in our living faces, afloat, dozing, upright.
I love that last image so much, the peonies. It's just gorgeous.
Thank you. Thank you. I felt that my mother gave me that poem because I wrote it long after she had died, and it won an award. So she knew I needed money.
Well, so we need to wrap up here, unfortunately, but do you have any advice? What would your advice be for poets who are developing manuscripts? Anything that you wish you'd known earlier?
Unconscious is always willing to come forth, and that's what we love. We love when it kicks in because that's when you're in the zone, and then you're. That's why we write, I really think, because I can feel so great after I write a brokenhearted poem. And yeah, I just value other poets, read, and don't be afraid to of what comes up, and put yourself out there. And as far as making a book, if you have a conscious idea, then fine, that's fine, go for it. But don't limit yourself with that, because something else might occur to you, and have things turn into other things. And in poetry, we talk about the turn. You're writing, and then suddenly there's a turn, and that's often where the poem picks up steam. And I think it was Naomi Nye that said, you want to write a poem about going to church, but the poem wants to take you to the dog races. and you follow where the poem wants to take you. Yeah, follow your unconscious. And that's why I like dreams too, because the unconscious is telling you things that you didn't know you knew.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, wonderful, Deborah. It's been such a pleasure to
thank you for asking
and to have this conversation. And thank you to our viewers for joining us. If you liked this interview, please consider sharing it. And if you aren't already a subscriber on Substack, again, go to poet2poet.substack.com and subscribe for free. Until next time, be well and keep writing.
Thank you.